Good morning, everybody. It's Pastor Chris here. It's Thursday, April 16th. It was snowing this morning in upstate New York, and I'm just going to leave that right there. But I hope you're well, and I'm going to be sharing the devotional with you guys today. I've called it Come and Get Some Rest, and it's found in Matthew chapter 11, verses 28 through 30. Jesus says in verse 28, "Come to me, all you who labor and are heavy laden, and I will give you rest. Take my yoke upon you and learn from me, for I am gentle and lowly in heart, and you will find rest for your souls." In verse 30, he says, "For my yoke is easy and my burden is light." Isn't Jesus amazing? You know, when I think about Jesus coming to the earth, he didn't come to the earth to establish a new religion. He came to the earth to restore a relationship between a perfect God and sinful men. In another case, he came to make what was always supposed to be primary again. Religion has a way of making things that are supposed to be secondary primary. So when you think of secondary things in a religious context, you think of things like Bible reading, Bible study, prayer, going to church, charitable giving, serving, volunteering for a ministry and outreach, feeding the poor, going on a mission trip, all those things. And they're all good things, right? Every single one of those things are good, and they're intended by God to make us more like Jesus. They're intended by God to help us to grow spiritually and to be a blessing to the world around us. But those things were never intended to be primary. Those things were always meant to be secondary. And when those things are done disconnected from what is primary, that's when all sorts of problems really begin to ensue. And so what Jesus is teaching here, what Jesus is offering here, is an opportunity to make things primary, make the things that are supposed to be primary. In fact, it's kind of what we said in the devotional the other day. Let's keep the main thing the main thing. What is the main thing? That is what Jesus is teaching here in Matthew 11. It's to come to him. That's what's so primary. That's what's most important. That is the greatest invitation we could ever receive, to come to him. Now, when we think about an invitation, there's three parts to an invitation. There is who's doing the inviting, who's doing the offering. It's the sending, right? The sender. And then there's the audience, or the recipient, or the receiver, right? The one that the invitation is directed towards. And then the thirdly is the invitation itself, what is being offered. And so we see all those pieces here, and I think this is what makes this section so powerful, is first of all, you see who is the invitation from, who's doing the sending, who's doing the inviting. And that's Jesus himself. Jesus is the one who does the offering. And so when we think about Jesus as the King of all kings and Lord of all lords, that's very clearly stated in the verse that precedes this section, in verse 27. Listen to what Jesus says in Matthew 11, verse 27. He says, "All things have been delivered to me by my Father." Now that's an echo of something Jesus will say in Matthew 28. Probably you're more familiar with it. In Matthew 28, verse 18, at the Great Commission, on the eve of his ascension to the right hand of the Father, Jesus says, "All authority in heaven and earth has been given to me." So this is a bold statement Jesus is making, but it's a statement that essentially is saying, I possess the full authority of the kingdom of God. And so Jesus is clearly making his claim as a king and as a ruler, but as we know, not an ordinary king, not an ordinary ruler. Because in these verses 28 to 30, he also describes himself as lowly, humble, and gentle. And what I see this is a stark contrast from Jesus and the other religious teachers and the other religious authorities, who in their case, they were prideful, they were puffed up, they were posturing themselves over top of the very people that they were supposed to be leading and helping and blessing. And Jesus is making a stark contrast from the standpoint of being a servant, being humble, being one who identifies with the very people that he's trying to lift up and trying to set free. And so what we see here is a picture of Jesus as a powerful God, all authority, everything committed and entrusted into his care, but also a personal God, one who has come literally to serve and to bless the very people that he's coming to save. So to the lowly, Jesus becomes low. To those who are burdened, Jesus takes the burden upon himself so that he could lift them up and bring them salvation. So that's who the invitation is from. But who's the invitation to? Well, this verse is very clear. It's to those who are weary and to those who are heavy laden. By definition, this speaks of someone who is exhausted, someone who is tired, someone who is fatigued and just spent, like a soldier who fights in battle for long hours and is just done, right? Or a messenger who had to travel a long way on a journey to deliver news, to deliver a message to someone. They just need rest. They're just tired. And Jesus is here. And I could say this both then and now, because it really hasn't changed much, but Jesus is here as we're exhausted with religious burdens, endless rules, endless regulations, tedious details that governed every part of a person's life that became next to impossible to try to meet. That's one part of the population that Jesus is speaking to, but the other part is kind of like the Pharisees or the scribes or those who have become so confident within themselves, self-reliant, self-righteous, those who have a tendency to just try to make things happen within their own strength. And before we begin to point the finger at them and those, we have to kind of look inside of ourselves and go, is that a little bit of me? Am I a little bit of that person, a self-made man, self-made woman? Do I try to push and make things happen within my own self without just completely releasing myself at the mercy of God? We've got to ask ourselves those questions, but that's who the invitation is for. Jesus is the one giving the invitation. The weary and the exhausted, the tired are the ones that he's giving the invitation to. But what's the invitation? And that's what is so powerful about these verses. The invitation is very simply to find rest for our souls, to find refreshment, to find rejuvenation for our souls. And what does it mean to rest? It means to stop. It means to pause. It means to put an end to something. It's closely tied into the idea of what a Sabbath was always meant to be. The Sabbath, Jesus would teach, the Sabbath was made for man, not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was supposed to be a blessing. The Sabbath was a ceasing from activity, from, in the Jews' case, on Friday evening to Saturday evening. There's really no ascribed day of the week for Christians. But the Sabbath was supposed to be a blessing where we rest and when we devote our full attention to God and worship and devotion, and when we're not striving and when we're not working. And it's supposed to be a time period where we find the true purpose in relationship, in pausing from all these other nonsense that kind of surrounds us throughout our lives. What religion had perverted, Jesus had come to restore. But not a day of the week like the Sabbath day, and not a religious duty or obligation, but a flourishing, fruitful relationship that would be found in this simple invitation, come to me. And that's what Jesus is offering and inviting us to in these verses. And that's what he is offering and inviting you to through this particular devotion. It's to come to him. What is primary? Come to Jesus. Is Bible reading good? Yes, but when it's done subservient to coming to him or for the purpose of coming to him, we got to keep the main thing. We've got to keep what is primary to God, primary to us. And specifically what this invitation means is that we would exchange the burden of religion and legalism for a freedom and a rest that's only found in him. It also means that Jesus is inviting us to find our identity in him, and an acceptance with the Father that eliminates the need to try to perform our way into God's good graces. It's not about doing, pushing, striving. It's about simply being and resting in the finished work of Jesus, who he's made us to be as we're found in him and he is in us. And then finally, he invites us to reject enslavement to those secondary things, whether it's religion, whether it's positions, wealth, status, or relationships, where we find our value in any of those things. We try to find our worth in any of those things. We simply rest in who Jesus is, and we find ourselves as slaves to righteousness, slaves to God, serving in the kingdom of God as image-bearing sons. Man, there's no greater privilege that we have. So come to Jesus today. Find rest. find refreshment, find rejuvenation, find revival. As you're kind of cooped up, as you're kind of locked down in the quarantine, whatever that specifies to your context right today where you are, I want to encourage you, and I want to invite you once again, maybe for the first time, come to Jesus. Find rest for your weary soul. Thanks, guys. I love you all so much. I hope you're blessed by this devotion. Come to Jesus. I promise you, he will never disappoint you.